Welcome everyone to this Open Hardware Talks, a series exploring the open source hardware ecosystem. This talk is part of the Hardware X podcast by Elsevier, and I'm your host and editor, Miriam Gradell. So the focus of today's roundtable is medtech in a broader sense, meaning we're talking equipment, medical devices, and even drugs when we talk medtech today. And the reason we've decided to focus on medtech is because, as most people know, medtech has an accessibility problem. And as the human population continues to age and we continue to see the disruption of climate change on local economies and ecosystems, the question is what's going to happen to these inequality gaps that we are already seeing. The notion is that they're going to get wider and larger than they've already been. And that leads to the question, what can we do about it? So that's the focus of today's Open Hardware Talks. And with me are Lukas Winter, who is the co-founder of the Open Source Imaging Initiative, which is working to develop the world's first clinically certified open source low-field MRI. We're also joined by Anthony Di Franco from OpenInsulin project, which is on the brink of completing its first open protocol for insulin production. And finally, we have Joe Knapper, developer of the OpenFlexure microscope project, focusing on the automation and medical applications of the system, as well as on-the-ground collaborations aimed at building trust in open source 3D printed healthcare devices. So welcome, everyone. And to kick off the conversation, I would like to ask you to briefly introduce your project. So Anthony, if we begin with you in a few sentences, what are current challenges? No, sorry, in a few sentences, what is OpenInsulin trying to do?
Well, in short, we are trying to make a foundation for the open source production of insulin in distributed networks of small producers. And that involves both the technical aspects of organisms that can produce insulin and equipment, and also the organizational aspects, how to have stakeholder-based governance and go through the regulatory process and go to market and so forth.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. And Lukas, if you could follow up and briefly explain to us, how did Open Source Imaging Initiative start?
Yeah, so basically, you mentioned already in the introduction, there was a frustration that MRI machines are very expensive and inaccessible. There was a frustration about black box science and non-reproducibility of many approaches, and so large discrepancies basically between if you have access to science or healthcare related to MRI machines or not. So there are large regions completely excluded. So this was basically the initial trigger, and then you start first to find technological solutions that could be adapted, and then when you realize that even if you make very cheap technologically cheap solutions that ultimately on the market, they are not that cheap anymore. So 50 euro electronics will be then maybe 10,000 euros medical devices. So then you have basically to add another puzzle piece, which is an open source strategy of things to basically create blueprints and reduce this huge hurdle that is between the technological innovation and the product on the market. And yeah, that's how it started, I would say. And then we started with basically taking the scientific community along, and now we're in the process of getting the private sector as well along. So that's where we are.
Exciting. And lastly, I think OpenFlexure, perhaps of these projects, is the one that's furthest along in its proof of concept. So maybe Joe, you can briefly outline for us, how is OpenFlexure enabling microscopy for everyone?
By doing a lot of the things that Anthony and Lukas have already talked about, things like locally manufacturing engaging with stakeholders, and especially medical stakeholders, as early as possible. Coming from an engineering background, there's a temptation to keep working on a prototype until you think it's perfect. But we've realised that the sooner and the more that we engage with clinical collaborators, the more useful that feedback is. And now we're at a point where our microscopes are being built in quite a few countries. At last count, they've been used on every continent in over 60 countries. And we try to provide the platform that people in each environment, understanding each unique challenge and opportunity, can then adapt it for what makes sense for them. We're not claiming that we've already built and perfected a microscope that's suitable for everyone everywhere, because that microscope doesn't exist. We work on the platform and people get in touch telling us the directions they've taken it.
Brilliant. Yeah, what I hear you say is that conventionally the idea is sort of we develop solutions in a one-size-fits-all kind of format, and that essentially what all three of you are trying to do is to make it more open and flexible. You've already mentioned some of the challenges that sort of motivated why these projects started. What I think was curious for me when I sort of read into some of these issues is that we're not just seeing gaps in access between, let's say, global north and global south, but even sometimes locally and regionally within, say, the context of the EU or the United States. So maybe relating back to your project a bit more in detail, could you enlighten us? What are some of the current challenges to accessibility that you have seen, both from, let's say, a technological perspective, but perhaps also from a systemic market perspective? And anyone who want to go first, go for it.
Well, I can speak a bit to the situation with insulin, both globally and in the US. Globally, it has a lot to do with supply chain and economic issues. There are problems with the incentives in international trade being correct to provide insulin to people who need it. There are issues shipping it from very large-scale centralized manufacturing facilities all the way out into places that may not have roads that can carry refrigerated trucks and have the required infrastructure to get it out there. And in the U.S., there is also a very complex and highly bureaucratic way of paying for and managing drugs and healthcare, and not just the U.S. Many other countries as well have this to some extent, but it might be the most egregious in the U.S. And so a lot of people fall through the cracks of that system. A lot of it is based on one's own employment or the employment of a spouse or something like that. And it's kind of the worst of the private and the public sides of the economy all rolled into one. And so that is an issue here. So even though it's a wealthy, developed country, because of this complexity and the bad incentives and the just brittleness of the system, people end up getting left behind by the system.
Yeah, I can continue. So from MRI perspective, so the current challenges are basically that the standard scanners they're very costly. They use a complicated technology. So use, for example, superconducting magnets. So it's something you can only do on industrial scale. There's a lot of there are only few actors on the market. It's not only the cost for the machine, but you need to have very dedicated room for it. You need to have the expertise, so the complexity is high, which also means that if you want to operate the machine, you need to have special knowledge. If you want to repair the machine, you need to have special knowledge. it's even the diagnosis. So it's not a quantitative machine. So there's a lot of complexity just around the machine itself. So one of the challenge, and of course a highly integrated device technologically. So one of the challenges was to simplify things. So what we are doing is we cannot build within a research environment or with low tools, low resource tools. We cannot build superconducting magnets, for example. So one thing was to basically identify, okay, how can it be simplified? Of course, with a reduced performance, but it's still clinically relevant. And then to make it in such a way modular that a person that wants to contribute, and this is a decentralized approach, so that a person that wants to contribute does not need to understand how an MRI machine works. It just needs to understand the module and then the specific questions around the module. So that's that was a challenge, or is a challenge to establish such an infrastructure. But basically, let's say the motivation in a way is as well that so if we succeed with basically doing that with an MRI machine, then I think we can do that with nearly any other medical device in the hospital. So we just create basically this blueprints on how to work together in a decentralized fashion, and there's a lot about how to communicate and yeah. So and of course then similar part like on the technological side, same for the certification. Yeah, so there's no clear blueprint on the certification pathway. Yeah, this information is simply not available. This is a whole different aspect, and yeah, very very valuable if you have someone that did it and is sharing actually this information. So these are the current challenges, I would say.
And I think it's probably a similar story in microscopy. Hugely important to get high quality devices in place, but the upfront cost is only part of the story. It's a big part of it, but simply having the device in place is only part of it. So World Health Organization estimates looking at donated medical equipment in sub-Saharan Africa say that less than half of the donated equipment ever ends up used. And that's due to a lack of training, a lack of consumables, often a lack of maintenance with built-in warranties and things like that. And also the huge amount of time that it takes for the often incredibly overworked doctors over there to become familiar with a new system, learn how to use it alongside devices that might have been donated from other manufacturers. So all of that is a challenge. And also on the side of people using it, walk around a pathology conference, and a lot of the time, a huge amount of the research that's going on now for things like microscopy and diagnosis is all about machine learning and AI. And so that's just widening the gap between the well-funded labs that have digital diagnostic techniques, digital slide scanners, things like that, and the huge areas of the world that are relying on manual techniques. And so the more research goes into using machine learning to triage cases, make diagnoses, filter out specimens, the more huge areas of the world aren't able to access the cutting edge technology that's being done. So microscopy is struggling from the point of getting the device in the first place through using it and then making sense of the results that come out at the end. And when microscopy is key for diagnosing cancer, malaria, a lot of parasites, it's a huge contributor to a lot of the burden that a lot of the global south does face.
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess supposedly the current system, there's a lot of money going into research, as you also mentioned, Joe, not necessarily the right research, or the research that's supposed to focus on inequalities in access to healthcare, but there are supposedly a lot of money going into developing devices and research and these things in the traditional sense of the system. So I guess the question is, to your knowledge, why isn't this current approach that we have with medtech working? Where is it that open source comes in and does something that the current system can't?
I think a big part of it is versatility. I think that working on building a new slide scanner, microscope, MRI, or syringe pump, whatever it is, it's very easy for the companies that have a huge amount of resources to aim for the markets that are closest to home, that are often also air conditioned, reliable power supplies. And if something breaks, then maybe an engineer needs to travel there, but they're traveling by car rather than intercontinental flight. I think that open source technology gives people the power at the point of care to modify it, to understand what's actually going on under the hood, avoiding that whole idea of a black box, and also inspiring trust. And that's something that we see in a lot of areas where people are interested in our microscope, is doctors and patients are fatigued by a lot of the current proprietary systems that they feel aren't designed for them, aren't designed for their environment, for their challenges, their samples. And so coming along with a novel approach of, we want to co-develop this with you. We haven't made this for you, but we want to understand where we can work together to make something that would fit in. And that's something that open source projects, especially as they grow, has perhaps more of the time for, more of the resources, and it's been set up for that idea of sharing from the start.
And maybe I would like to chip in here as well, because also to just be able to evaluate whatever it is, if it's a microscope, if it's an MRI machine, or just to be able to properly evaluate it in a healthcare environment. I think that's also a big chance for open source, because I mean, just from making the example of MRI machines, in multi-center studies, you have to have the same vendor, you have to probably have the same software version, otherwise you're not able to properly compare results. So if you really want to progress in healthcare and to evaluate how good something is, I think we just need a little bit more transparency. So I think this will definitely help. And then probably also in terms of in the long run, of course, in terms of safety as well. I think just the more you know and the more people are able to evaluate it, the better, because you're always building up on the previous version. And if you get a new machine, you're typically not 100% sure what's inside. No? So that's also a problem.
Yeah, I'd like to add a bit as well, if I may. So we're seeing many similar themes also in our work with OpenInsulin. One aspect is one that you were speaking to a bit, Joe, which is we're developing technologies that are intended to be used in all kinds of different social contexts, economic contexts, different levels of infrastructure, different different needs, different constraints, and doing that in an open source way makes it possible to build up in a commons, economically a commons, and in a more general sense, everything that can be used across all those different contexts, which is often the most technically demanding part of what's going on. And it's nonetheless, it can be done outside of the need to pursue some very specific market niche, or something that would be the main goal and the main incentive in a business context. And businesses good businesses can be run using the open source foundation, but that comes later. It's important to separate that out so that you have something to work with to start. In addition, there was another point, but I'll see if that comes back to mind.
That's good. But maybe, Anthony, actually following on from this conversation here, maybe you could put a few words to how is the community around OpenInsulin contributing to and enabling the project?
Yeah. Well, okay. The point did come back to mind. Just a quick follow-up. On the business side, what we find is that there's a tendency, especially in a really either technically demanding or highly regulated or both area, which medicine is both, for monopolies and oligopolies to form for various reasons, and then having an open source technology base is a large defense against that, and can keep the incentives to serve everyone intact. And so that's the other side of it. And now, how is the community contributing? I think people are, well, one of the reasons that people have joined our effort is out of both just personal frustration and sense that things aren't working in a broader way. People coming either from academic or corporate backgrounds, or having diabetes themselves or having loved ones who do, and seeing how these narrowly focused monopolistic or oligopolistic institutions don't permit them to do what they can see needs to be done. That leads them to recognize the the advantages that we've all spoken to about this approach, and what are people actually doing? It's actually still an almost entirely volunteer effort. We have 3 labs now in our network, one, the founding lab in Oakland, one in Baltimore, and one in France. And in the Oakland lab, it's based in a community biohacking space. In Baltimore, it's in a very similar space, but they have a little bit more in the way of ties to the academic world. The president there is a professor at local university, so they're maybe even more so, getting people who are still students or are looking at careers, but are also looking to do things that they couldn't do just following those tracks. And in the French chapter, the people there are actually working on setting up open source businesses and working on developing an open source strain of Gia pastoris, which is a yeast that we use and that is often used to produce proteins. And they're seeing opportunities to make their livings running businesses that build on this base and provide the supplies to those who need to use them.
Super great. And it's interesting that you said how most of them are volunteers, because Lukas, in the open source imaging initiative, you also have a lot of teams around the world that are contributing to the design and forking it and feeding back to the community all kinds of things. So I guess I'm curious to understand, and everyone feel free to chip in with this, but maybe Lukas, you can start. How do you incentivize community members to contribute? Does altruism go that far, or how do you keep a community engaged in the project?
Yeah, I have to say, altruism goes very, very far. So to be honest, of course, there are different incentives why people join and they leave again, and some are more short term, and some are, let's say, longer term contributors that really believe in the vision. There are incentives of just having your own MRI machine for your research institution, which of course you can do things that you maybe have an idea you want to test, or maybe we just had recently the case. So I'm also coming from the ultra high field MRI. This is how I started. They're even more expensive, these machines. So for example, there was one institution where their machine is broken. So they want to continue, of course, somehow the research. So now they want to build this low field system. There are now also more and more incentives coming from to contribute as well, actually from companies that maybe not just use some modules of the system. Some of them are also contributing back to the community. So that different incentives, but mostly I think it's around this let's say altruistic collaborative vision of doing things differently. And maybe I just maybe also to add this because this is a bit how I do see it, and with if you have a company and this developed over many years, making a very efficient product. So if you see the company as an organism and it produces a very good, high quality product, it does that with processes that developed over time, and there is a certain efficiency to it. And if you say, okay, that's very efficient, that's the market leader. So within the company, of course, all the information is being shared. There are different departments, but they work together. Not all of them know everything, but they somehow work together. And so seeing it, but now from the global perspective, where we don't do that, where it's mostly about competition, we still have a lot of public healthcare systems, so it's not so clear why it's not being done in this way. So we are not doing it very efficiently on a global scale. Yeah. So this, I think, would be this idea to do it like that, and to be actually more efficient with overall with the resources we invest in healthcare. And coming back to the incentives, so these are some of the incentives coming from this direction as well.
Yeah, I think altruism is always going to be one of the core reasons for people to contribute, but let's not pretend that there isn't also a side where it benefits the person who is contributing. We've got a forum, people pop up all the time with suggestions that range from very, very small tweaks that we'd quite like to see to huge redesigns of the project that would take us back to 2017 in some ways. And people can go on the forum and see what people have contributed and how engaged the community is with the suggestions they get and the ideas and the tweaks. And a lot of people come on saying, well, I wish this project was for me, but I'm not an engineer, or, I've never built anything like this before. But perhaps they're a teacher who wants to run a workshop in their school, and just by sharing some of the ideas they've had and a few of the images they've taken of a sample we've never seen before, they see that they get a lot back of enthusiasm and celebration from the community. And it's something we're working on at the minute, really putting a spotlight on the people who've contributed to the project one way or another over the years. So yes, altruism is at the core of it, but also people believe in the mission. People see that it can benefit them, benefit their school, their research, their lab, their family. We've had people get in touch saying, hey, really cool project, we're thinking of building it on a date. you don't know exactly what people are hoping to get out of it. And so that's where you want to give people the chance to share their story and why it interests them. And I remember the first time I heard about the idea of open source insulin production. And that really stuck with me, because I think that is a lot of people's go-to example of where conventional proprietary drug development is failing people in a very visible and consistent way. And so there is the altruism of people think this should happen. There's also people who are frustrated and angry and want to see that change in the world, and so are happy to put the time in. So I'm really curious to hear from Anthony how often you do hear stories like that.
You mean about people's motivations of that sort? Or well,
Yeah,
what
personal,
you? Yeah,
personal
well,
motivations, things that what drives them on to contribute to this project out of all the ones that are out there.
There certainly have been people who, oneself or a loved one is struggling with these kinds of things, but it's never really been. I mean, if someone were really in a dire emergency, then such a person would not have time to contribute to an open source project, probably. But I think there's an appreciation that a lot of people are going to suffer if something is not done about the status quo, and that is just it's so much in the background of what's obvious that we don't really even bother talking about it often. But it's good to mention. And I think maybe I'll just build on some of what you're saying, which is and having diabetes, which I do, really puts this in, makes it very starkly apparent. To have diabetes is to have one's life depend hour by hour on the supply of some drug, and there is a profound loss of control and agency in one's own life that comes with that condition. And people in such situations are very interested in getting out of that situation, regaining the agency and the control. And that isn't something that is unique to diabetes or medicine. I think it is part of the whole contrast between open source technology and technology that's developed in the context of a corporate business, which is, and you see it in the equipment and how, you need this version of the drivers for this version of the board, and it's very brittle and it'll break. As all of that whole way of doing things, it's all about making an addict of you in some sense, and making you always come back for help with this or that, or to get part or a supply or whatever it is that you need, and that's the pattern, and it's fundamentally an abusive pattern, and it is taking away your agency and your control over what you're doing. And I think as both of you said at some points, like if you're a doctor and you're trying to get something done, it's very frustrating and concerning and alarming to always be distracted in this way, and to have this realization somewhere in your mind that whoever is always getting you to come back isn't is kind of trying to help you do your job, but only in this very narrow way, right? And open source just blows that all up, and you have to take on a little bit more of the agency and control, but once you do, you've got it, and it's yours. And that maybe that's why what we're doing resonates with people, as you mentioned, like, because everyone encounters some version of that, I think. And just with diabetes, it's, you know, it's your life minute by minute, hour by hour, but there are a lot of things like that, even if they're not quite as extreme. And, you know, it's often your life in some sense, or something that you care deeply about in some way.
Yeah, I think what I also hear you all say is what open source is kind of gives some freedom back. We're living in a time where we're seeing a lot of the institutions we're supposed to believe in, or political actors completely turn away from the good or the will of people. And that's where open source can come in and can reclaim some control and allow to sort of not just create solutions or access solutions, but also fix or take a look or criticize the current structures and systems we have in place. There is something I was interested in, though, is that while open source is really promising and it's gaining a lot of momentum, and as you've mentioned, altruism does take people very, very far, we're still in a system that has some standards and some structures in place. And specifically when it comes to medtech, you mentioned this, Anthony, there's a high barrier for certification and for being approved. And Joe, because OpenFlexure, I believe, is furthest in this journey, maybe you can talk a bit about your experience with transforming what started as a research project into a design that can align with all these standards that are required for medical devices.
Well, I should definitely make it clear from the start that we are not medically certified. And while we're hopefully a long way through that journey, it is definitely a journey that takes some time. And we're aware that in some ways OpenFlexure is leading this in a way where it's hard to be the first. For example, we're aiming to be the first digital diagnostic device manufactured and then used in Tanzania. And so we've been working with the health regulators there on how that should look, how the certification should look. And a lot of becoming compliant, although there are the ISO standards and things like that, 13485 is emblazoned in my skull at this point. Comparing it to an academic project, which is how OpenFlexure started, I think is much better summed up in terms of changes of attitude rather than looking at individual requirements. And academic prototypes, hardware, lab demos, things like that. If it's academic, there's a certain amount of leeway where you can get away with saying, oh yeah, it just does that sometimes. I don't know how anyone would feel going to the hospital hearing the technicians there talking about the MRI or the microscope or, you know, the vending machine, and hearing that it just does that sometimes. So instead it needs to be, we understand. Oh yeah. But the attitude instead needs to be, we don't just understand what it does most of the time, but what it does every time. And there's also this really interesting phrase that you see a lot for certification of, have you thought about reasonably foreseeable misuse of your device? Which, if it's a microscope, perhaps certified for one or two specific conditions, the reasonably foreseeable misuse might be you're in a hospital without other diagnostic digital microscopes. You might be in a hospital without any other microscopes. Is it reasonably foreseeable that a pathologist who feels like they've got no other option for their patient is going to reasonably foreseeably misuse it by using it for something else? Misuse in plugging it in wrong or using the wrong settings, and it's this attitude of, it's not about what can I make it do on a lab tour in a nice air-conditioned lab in my specific university, but what can we make sure it can always do time after time, and when it doesn't, we know why it didn't, and we make sure that it's not going wrong anywhere near to a patient. If you want to read ISO 13485 to get a more in-depth idea of the changes, I don't recommend it. But it is this idea of a change of attitude of, I don't want to say paranoia, but perhaps maybe I should.
Yeah, so certification, getting to that step is a high barrier and a lot of tricky things to live up to. And yeah, as you said, for anybody who wants to check out the ISO, you don't recommend it. So maybe come to you instead and get some advice. But Lukas, you're also going through the same process with the MRI, or at least moving closer towards beginning the process of clinical certification. So I guess my question to you is, what would it mean for the open source low field MRI if it achieved this clinical certification?
Yeah, I mean, this would be clearly a huge, huge milestone. And it's a bit like Joe said. So you have maybe your research paper. It's a complete different story if you want to make a product out of it that's just safe to use, independent of how good it is, not just to make a product out of it. Then it's a different story if you want to have a product that is being used for diagnosis or treatments of a human being that needs, of course, to have this, again, a completely different level. So it needs to be done properly. It needs to be according to standards. It needs to have checks by regulatory bodies, and it makes complete sense. What doesn't make sense is that there's basically not a real blueprint for that. No, so it's a different process in the US than it's in Europe. Then it depends which regulatory bodies you go to. It's still the same device, right? So the intrinsic safety of the device, I would say, is the same, but depends where you go. You have to provide different documentation, maybe different tests, etc. So just going through this, sharing this knowledge, I think this will be already huge, because then you have actually a blueprint that you can build upon, and you can make then deviations. And if you then do the rebuilds, you know what's your path technologically, what's your path just research-wise to get some first in vivo data without having any day-to-day clinical routine, and then what's your path to actually produce a product out of it to sell it as a medical device. And I think having this whole chain, this would be amazing. This would be, of course, amazing. And then you can build up on that, create your innovations, deviations, local adaptations, if it's technologically or if it's from regulatory perspective. This would be amazing. Yeah.
And also leading on to that, Anthony, in the case of OpenInsulin, so one thing is creating an open protocol for the insulin itself, but how are you looking into what are your thoughts on ensuring that if you go through with this decentralized manufacturing model, that the open protocol can live up to things such as the good manufacturing and good distribution practices that are set for drugs manufacturing?
Well, the foundation of our plans in that area is the precedent of small contract manufacturers operating in both drug research and commercial drug production, to some extent, of drugs with smaller markets. So they're already operating at a scale that is compatible with all our thinking here. I think, recognizing that there are a lot of little niches that deserve attention that don't get it, and there are a lot of ways that technology could be developed and used that don't fit into the much more constrained agenda of an organization that has to produce for the entire world, or a significant portion of it, something like that. And our manufacturing partner is also developing a thesis that this is very important for biosecurity and supply chain resiliency, and a lot of concerns that you were kind of speaking to, Miriam, at the very beginning, of where we have a lot of factors that are destabilizing these very brittle global supply chains that everything depends on, political, environmental, economic, and it's just, something very brittle that is subjected to a lot of stress is going to break inevitably, sooner than anyone probably wants to really acknowledge. So now, so those are the incentives in the context. What does that mean for us in practice? There have already been some signs that the insulin being delivered through these very complex global supply chains may have quality issues, and that may not live up to the theoretical version of the gold standard that things that are produced in these really sophisticated, complex ways are supposed to meet. And fundamentally, these are technical challenges that just get out of control when you're working at such a large scale. If you have a bioreactor that is 3 stories tall, just the chemical engineering problem of mixing it from the bottom to the top so that the conditions are uniform so that the stuff can grow in it, that becomes a very daunting technical problem. And if you're trying to maintain surveillance and a refrigerated supply chain and have the integrity of that supply chain go all the way from one factory in Denmark or something all the way out to Botswana, that is a very daunting technical challenge. And doing that alongside 100 other similar routes, right, or 1,000, right? So the difficulty of ensuring quality scales, not necessarily linearly, but faster with the size of that supply chain and its complexity. So, it's kind of a network that's growing, and a lot of the concerns are, based in how big and complex that network is, not just in terms of bulk, but in terms of the relationships in it. And sometimes it is just bulk. That bioreactor is like something that was a uniform thing when it's the 30-liter bioreactor that can fit in the corner of your room, and now it's 10,000 liters or 1,000 liters. Now something that was just one thing becomes a continuum of things, and now you have that introduces a new dimension to the engineering. So there are a lot of instances like this where we found that it could be much more economical and safer and more reliable to just take a group of 10,000 customers or 1,000 customers, and each one pays $30 a month, and they form a cooperative, and they that's a pretty good budget for that's 30,000 a month or 300,000 a month in that neighborhood, let's say. And they hire some experts who run everything and report on that, and they could send out a newsletter every month to everyone saying, like, here's what we found and here are the numbers and we're within the tolerances. And when they go to distribute that, they're only going to distribute that to 1,000 or 10,000 people. And therefore it's very simple to keep track of every single thing that happens of any interest or concern within that much smaller group. And so you just simplify the problem radically. And this is already roughly the scale at which a lot of the manufacturing for R&D in smaller markets is happening. So the technical foundation is already there. And it's just a matter of open sourcing the knowledge of how to do that, and then organizing those groups, organizing the cooperative structure of the business around that technical foundation. And I think that applies to a lot of things, in medicine and in the broader economy as a whole. Like we're watching a lot of very brittle and wasteful arrangements face stresses that are breaking them or that are starting to make them crumble. And this is going to be the kind of response that will be apt to meet these kinds of challenges.
Yeah, so what I hear you say is really this taking on an ecosystem approach to how you do open source, but also future markets, future supply, and really build an ecosystem around what you're doing. And it's also interesting then to think ecosystem resilience. And I think a lot of times what we don't talk about in open source is the ability to keep a solution going after an initiator or one actor might have disappeared or gone away. And I guess a question I have maybe to Joe or to whoever wanted to chip in on this, but what would happen if, let's say, OpenFlexure and your team disappeared tomorrow? What would happen to the project? Would it then just disappear, or how is open source also kind of creating some resilience in that sense?
Well, we're not going anywhere. Reliant on academic funding as ever. But what OpenFlexure is now is a few different things. So there's OpenFlexure, the academic team in Glasgow, Scotland. But we also have a core development team that's spread across the country, across the UK, and then a team of users who have contributed. And especially, if I'm talking about OpenFlexure, I am talking about the people before I'm talking about the 3D printing. I'm talking about Daniel Rosen in the United States and Catherine McKinley in Tanzania, and so many people who would keep going with OpenFlexure because they get in touch with us often to just share good news and to ask small things, not for the day-to-day support. We've had a professor in Japan get in touch saying, hey, we found your designs, we printed them, we modified them, we used them for a completely new microscopy mode. We've published the paper. Here's the link. We hope you don't mind. And we didn't mind. That's sort of what you're aiming for with open source, right? Is letting it out there so that people do give the project a life of its own. And it's terrifying because you never know what people are going to use it for. But also, that is what we're signing up for. So if we disappear tomorrow from academia, there's all these other people who are going to carry it on, ongoing projects. I'm just back from Brazil, where the hospital DMO there are manufacturing and working on doing non-inferiority studies with the microscope. And that'll carry on with or without me. I choose with me. But as I've alluded to, this is also not a purely academic project anymore. It doesn't fit nicely into the novel, shiny, adding something new every few months that academia does reward. And one of the steps we've taken is we've founded a charity in the UK that works on getting the designs to local manufacturers, local users around the world in a context that isn't limited by being novel and shiny, and instead focuses on being impactful. And so that charity is where, if the academic funding ever did dry up, I'm hoping that the majority of things will move to in time anyway. So as soon as a project hits a sort of critical point where people are relying on it and using it, it's not going anywhere. And neither are we.
Same here.
That is good to hear. Of course, we hope you don't go anywhere, but also it's good to hear that there is resilience in these projects. This has been a very, very fascinating talk so far. I only have one question left to all of you, which is I would love to hear your 2 cents to, is open source the answer to the future of medtech?
Well, I'd love to say that it's the answer to all of the problems that medtech and maybe tech and just the world is facing. I don't think we'll ever see a world where all medical technology is open source, in the same way I don't think we'll ever see a world where all computers are open source and all operating systems and programs and things like that. But open source is here to stay. And something that Anthony said, I think, is really important, where we're in a world where people do want that control and that autonomy. And to stop the oligarchies that he referred to from overstepping, something needs to keep these things in check, something where when people are tired of subscription costs going up month after month and the local production being shut down, so suddenly things involve shipping costs and maybe even tariffs, all affect how you can access something. I think that open source and people saying, let's share that knowledge, let's share the know-how, let's share our resources, is an important tool to always bring things back into a better equilibrium. So is it the future? It's definitely part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I already said yes, but I'll elaborate a little bit and maybe try to tie some of the threads together. And we were just saying this, open source is resilient and it sticks around and it doesn't, get flushed down the toilet when the organization that supposedly owns it goes out of business or whatever. That is that resilience means that open source can just keep growing incrementally while all of the proprietary stuff breaks and shatters. And that in itself, I think, is the reason why it's the future. And it also is in a much better symbiotic relationship with the people who use it. The more agency people have, the more they're going to choose the option that puts them in control, and that is preferable in many ways to just being addicted to a supply from an exploitative supplier. And I think that dynamic means it just wins the competition as long as there's any remote element of fairness to that competition. And so there are a lot of factors that are piled up that kind of try to stack the deck on the other side, but those are all, they are themselves brittle because they have this really brittle link in their chain, and so they're not gonna, I think there will always be some little areas where that is still worth maintaining for somebody for some reason, but it's not going to be the foundation of how we do everything for too much longer, I think. And now really is the time in history where that shift is becoming urgent and is really accelerating.
Yeah, sorry for that. I guess it's my turn to talk about the open source and the future of medtech. So just in different words, what Anthony and Joe basically said already. I mean, open source in medtech doesn't really exist at the moment. I think it will definitely exist in the future. So I think we're all working on that. So it will be definitely part of the future of medtech. Probably not all of it. But I think the arguments are, it's less risk. It's a bit slower than the current approach, but it builds up. So there's less risk to it. It's more efficient, I would also argue, if we really find a way to channel all the global resources into it. What we talked about, certification standards. I mean, of course, the MRI stuff that we're doing, there are some parts of it that will also benefit Joe and vice versa. So this is all based on certain standards that are not MRI related, but maybe electrical safety or other things, and the same with many other ways. So it's more efficient, and actually, just the idea of it is just so good that I don't believe it can be stopped. So when it's a good idea, it will somehow succeed. And I think we saw that also with open source software. Of course, with hardware, it takes a bit longer and doesn't make sense in all the domains, even though it would be nice. But with medical technology, I think it's a different story. It just takes much longer because it's much more difficult to adapt. But I'm sure it will be definitely part of the future.
And I think that proprietary projects do have that head start right now, where they've got the know-how, they've got experience taking things through certification, things like that. They've got huge budgets. I don't mind admitting that there are probably some pharmaceutical companies with higher budgets than OpenFlexure. So the fact that we're still talking about all the opportunities and all the challenges out there show that the conventional proprietary supply chains are failing, and it's a failure of conventional manufacturing. And so open source is bringing that ability to address failures and address them in a way that learns from the mistakes of the past and learns from, the huge areas of the world, arguably the majority of the world, that is failed by proprietary, conventional, traditional systems.
Lovely. I think this has been a really informative and really engaging conversation. It's been wonderful to learn more about all of your projects and to hear some of the aspects, the challenges you've met, the potentials that you see. And I want to say once again, thank you very much for joining today and sharing everything. And I wish you the best of luck on all your projects.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank
Thanks.
you.
Pleasure talking to you.
Yes, thanks, Miriam.
Thank you.